Welcome to this deep dive. We're tackling a stack of sources today, pulling out the key information.
And today's topic is, well, it's intense.
It is. We're looking into trauma-based programming, drawing from excerpts of a document titled ChainlessSlaves.pdf.
Yeah, and we really need to stress up front, this material is deeply sensitive. It can be quite unsettling, even disturbing to engage with.
Absolutely. So just to be crystal clear, our aim here isn't to confirm or deny anything in this text.
No opinions, no external validation.
Exactly. Our job today is purely to understand the concepts, the alleged methods, the stated goals of what this document calls trauma-based programming. We're sticking only to what's written in these pages.
Right. The source lays out definitions, techniques, purported aims, even internal structures described within this specific context. We're just focused on unpacking that information.
Okay, let's get into it then. The document defines this programming first as systematic, calculated torture.
Systematic and calculated, that's key.
And the stated purpose is apparently to block the subject's conscious processing of what's happening.
So right away, it emphasizes this isn't random violence, according to the text. It's presented as a methodology.
A methodology using suggestion, hypnosis, conditioning, all aimed at implanting thoughts and directives deep in the unconscious.
And this, the text claims, leads to creating dissociated identities, alters or parts.
These alters are then, reportedly, programmed to make the person act, feel, or think in certain ways.
Ways the programmer intends, crucially.
And the ultimate goal described. The subject follows these directives without conscious awareness, even if it goes completely against their own moral compass.
Which is, frankly, a chilling objective as laid out here.
Now, how does the document say this is even possible? It points to dissociation.
Right. The individual's capacity to dissociate. It frames it not as an illness, but as a natural defense against overwhelming pain or trauma.
Like the mind compartmentalizing unbearable experiences.
Exactly. And the document suggests programmers actively exploit this defense mechanism.
It says the success relies on the person's inherent ability to dissociate, their pain threshold.
And even their imagination. Which is an interesting detail.
Yeah, it says imagination is needed to create these sort of walled-off personalities to hold the programming.
This raises the question of selection, then. The text mentions a genetic predisposition for dissociation,
Implying some people might be seen as, well, better candidates according to this document's logic.
and it also suggests, quite grimly, that families with histories of multi-generational abuse are sources for finding people with this dissociative ability.
Exploiting existing trauma, basically.
That's what the text implies. It also mentions that the foundational programming happens in clinically controlled environments.
Underscoring the need for total control, it seems.
But interestingly, it's not presented as a one-size-fits-all process.
Oh.
How so? The document suggests the subject's own creativity, their perceived purpose, influences the unique aspects of their programming, like how they visualize things.
So it's systematic, but also tailored.
That's the picture the text paints, a calculated manipulation adapted to the individual.
Still, it does mention common control features, too. Symbols, colors, scripts, things like that.
Right, suggesting maybe some universal triggers or anchors across different subjects.
And the absolute foundation of all this, according to the document, fear.
Crippling fear on a spiritual and emotional level.
And built on that fear are guilt and shame.
Yes, the guilt is specifically mentioned as binding the subject to the programmers, creating loyalty and preventing disclosure.
It's a twisted kind of loyalty described there.
And the methods used to induce all this trauma and dissociation. The text lists electroshock, physical torture, abuse, mind games.
All aimed, it says, at overwhelming the mind, forcing it to fragment to allow the programming in.
A truly brutal picture painted by the source material.
Okay, so let's shift to the specific applications and techniques mentioned. Drugs come up briefly.
Just as a category, yeah. It doesn't list specific ones, but implies psychotropic meds play a role.
It goes into more detail on brainwave frequencies, though.
It does. Lists delta, theta, alpha, beta, gamma, even epsilon and lambda.
And connects them to states of consciousness or programming goals,
Yeah.
like astral projection.
Right, linking theta and delta to that, for example. It tries to correlate brain states with desired outcomes.
It even mentions specific techniques like binaural beats.
Yeah, giving the example of a 4 Hz beat for theta-delta states and hemispheric synchronization.
And ELF waves, extremely low frequency.
For thought and emotion modification, allegedly. These are concepts you sometimes hear about elsewhere, presented here as tools of manipulation.
Then there are brief mentions of double-meaning words and programming codes.
Suggesting linguistic tricks and maybe coded language for triggers.
And then the torture methods in more detail. It's quite grim.
Extremely. It lists categories.
Yeah.
Electroshock, beatings, burning, sensory deprivation, sleep deprivation, psychological torture.
With specific examples like stress positions, sensory bombardment, hell confinement, the Tucker telephone.
The sheer variety described is disturbing. It underscores the alleged systematic brutality.
The text also briefly mentions internal structures and symbols and internal base systems.
Probably referring to the imagined internal architecture of the programmed mind. Symbols as triggers, bases as control points.
It zooms in on electric shock torture, ECT, methods, risks.
Paralysis, fibrillation, death are listed as risks, and its use for amnesia.
The level of detail is stark. Current, duration, voltage, resistance, path of the current, factors affecting severity.
Yes, it lays out those technical-sounding details.
Then there's a section on games used in programming.
Hide and seek, sticks and stones, save the egg, minefield.
A shrinking vessel, three-way tug of war, and punishment for losing.
Using games, especially with children, to normalize abuse. That's a particularly insidious tactic described here.
Trauma bonding also gets a brief mention.
That unhealthy attachment between victim and abuser. Another tool for control, the document implies.
Then it gets into inside parts, alters, and their creation.
Separation through dissociation, programmers having relationships with different parts.
A child's creativity being twisted by torture.
And these parts being triggered, anchored to trauma. Even film trauma as an anchor is mentioned.
The text suggests these parts function as, well, real and separate people inside.
It even mentions creating balancing point parts, calm, cheerful ones.
As a way to maintain some stability.
Potentially, or another layer of control. It highlights the calculated nature described in the document.
And finally, in this section, a long list of internal programs. Alpha, amnesia, anger management, assassination, beta, betrayal, dozens.
Yeah, a whole catalog of alleged program types and functions. It suggests a very complex, layered system of control being claimed.
Okay, moving to specific examples and details, document provides. Traumatizing people on specific dates, birthdays, holidays.
To inlay clocks, it says, for future triggering, temporal anchoring.
Linking dates to programmed reactions. Wow.
It also talks about hiding genealogies, creating cover lives for subjects.
Especially those with a designated purpose to avoid detection, external manipulation.
Exactly. Making the programmed life look normal on the outside.
There's a really disturbing bit about conditioning children to believe in a synthetic reality.
By manipulating all five senses, controlling their entire perception of the world.
Constructing an artificial reality, essentially.
That's what the text alleges. It even mentions potential programming starting in the womb. Maternal influence.
Prenatal influence. Through thoughts, feelings, music.
That's the suggestion, a very early start.
Then it introduces shadow parts and using one-way mirrors and demonic implantation.
To guard memories, it says. Separating an alter from awareness of its own abuse. It's a very complex and dark claim.
It also describes techniques for handling different types of alters. Orderly, obstinate, optimistic, greedy, anxious.
Showing an alleged awareness and manipulation of various personality traits within the dissociated system.
And joint programmer techniques, like Mutt and Jeff.
The classic good cop, bad cop routine, basically. A psychological manipulation tactic described.
Then we get the 12 steps of obedience.
A sequence designed, it says, to create a highly dissociative subject, disconnected from their own needs and feelings.
Not need, not want, don't hope. Eroding the sense of self to make scripting alters easier.
That's the stated purpose in the text.
It also talks about sensory deprivation effects. Superstition, attachment to objects, hallucinations.
Suggesting it's used to destabilize reality perception further. Profound psychological effects, intentionally induced according to the text.
Building covels for subjects is detailed too. Allowed spending money, associations where they can go, hobbies.
Again, that external control to maintain the facade.
Programming music is another point. Lyrics as hypnotic cues.
Tailored playlists. Specific songs used during torture to reinforce scripts. It mentions Wizard of Oz, Disney songs.
Those come up a lot in these kinds of narratives, don't they?
They do. The document reflects that theme.
It even notes subtle physical indicators, like foot movement revealing pulse changes.
Suggesting constant monitoring and analysis of the subject's state by the programmers described.
Rapport is stressed as important. Techniques for building it, even with hostile subjects.
That connection, even manipulative, being key for influence.
The beginning of programming section is very detailed. Depatterning with electroshocks.
Intensive verbal signal repetition for triggers. Sensory isolation. EEG monitoring.
Programming on a metal table, IVs, restraints, meds, binaural beats.
And implanting scripts linked to specific alters, triggers, consequences. A highly organized, invasive process described.
Infant programming techniques are also outlined. Prenatal splitting attempts.
Early fragmentation via abuse, isolation, abandonment programming, continued by caregivers, introducing the obedience steps early on.
The idea of starting in infancy, it's horrific as presented.
Absolutely. And then raising a child subject, instructions for parents.
Encouraging dissociation. Writing backwards, isolation, simulated drowning, freezing.
Systematic punishment for secrecy, needle insertions, burns for tantrums, soap in the mouth, daily rape and torture. The cruelty described as extreme.
Just awful. The text notes the programmer's focus shifts from the person to the task later, but rapport remains crucial for compliance.
Maintaining that balance between the goal and managing the subject's state, allegedly.
Drugs come up again, inducing trance, locking alters, enhancing trauma with vortexes and traps, out-of-body experiences.
Portrayed as a critical tool for consciousness manipulation.
Then there's that very detailed list of brainwave frequencies again, specific hertz ranges.
Linked to relaxation, pain relief, memory, focus, sleep, even chakras, organs, physical conditions.
It seems like an attempt to give it a pseudoscientific veneer.
That's how it reads. Including associations not scientifically validated.
Examples of double-meaning words are given, codes for psychological classifications.
Suggesting complex embedded communication and control systems, as described.
The descriptions of physical and psychological torture methods are repeated, reinforcing the brutality.
Yes, the graphic nature is consistent and disturbing.
Programming symbols again, Alice in Wonderland, Wizard of Oz themes.
Familiar narratives potentially used as symbolic anchors.
And then detailed descriptions of types of inside parts. Game maker, gatekeeper, queen of the clones, randomizer, recycler, resistor, many others.
Each with a supposed function in the alleged internal structure. Suggests a highly compartmentalized internal world is claimed.
Finally, specific internal programs listed with functions. Alpha for alignment, beta for sexual control, death programs, gamma for cult loyalty.
And it ends with a glossary defining terms like alter, anchor, rapport, script, switching.
Providing a framework for the terminology used throughout the document.
Okay, so summing up this deep dive into ChainlessSlaves.pdf, we've really walked through the core themes it presents.
Yeah, this idea of systematic trauma-based programming, focused on dissociation, creating alters through torture.
Using a whole range of alleged techniques, all aiming for control and manipulation, according to the text itself.
And we absolutely have to stress again, this exploration was based only on this document.
We're not endorsing it, we're not verifying it, none of that.
Just presenting the information found within it. And we know this content is deeply disturbing. We recognize it might have an impact on you, the listener.
Which leads to maybe a point for you to consider. What are your own thoughts on the sheer level of detail here? The specific methods described.
What kind of psychological impact could you even imagine these alleged techniques having, based on how the document portrays them?
It might lead you to reflect further on the concepts of trauma itself, or dissociation, or the very idea of mind control as it's laid out in this particular source.
We encourage you to engage with these complex ideas thoughtfully, based on what we've pulled from the document today.
Thank you for joining us and engaging with this very challenging material.